What if I told you some Florida cities are now so unaffordable that working families spend more on housing than many make in a month? And in some of them, home values are already tanking, even as rents stay sky high. This isn't just a statistic. It's a crisis reshaping lives, pushing out locals, and creating a housing system that increasingly serves investors rather than people. We're diving into the 10 Florida metros where the housing crisis is already hitting hardest, where prices, rents, and demand collided to push residents into deep financial stress. This matters now because the fallout is spreading. Bursting prices, surging cost burdens, rising foreclosures, and shrinking hope for affordability. These aren't just numbers on a chart. They're families being priced out of their own communities, workers forced into impossible choices, and the slow erosion of what made Florida livable in the first place. Orlando sits at number 10, and the math here is brutal. Housing prices surged so dramatically that the income-to-home price ratio now sits around 10.3 to 1. What does that actually mean? It means the typical home costs more than 10 times what the average household earns in a year. For context, a healthy ratio is usually considered to be around 3 to 1. Anything above 5 starts creating serious affordability problems. Orlando blew past that threshold years ago. Middle-class wages haven't kept pace, not even close. While home prices climbed steadily through the pandemic and beyond, incomes stayed relatively flat. The result is predictable. Homeownership became unreachable for huge swaths of the population. Young professionals, service workers, teachers, nurses, people who make the city function, are now locked out of buying. Instead, they're pushed into crowded, expensive rental markets where landlords know demand is high and supply is tight. Rent keeps climbing because people have nowhere else to go. The dream of building equity, of stability, of owning something, it's slipping further out of reach every year. The ripple effects extend beyond just housing costs. When young families can't buy homes, they can't build generational wealth. They can't put down roots. They remain perpetually transient, always one lease renewal away from displacement. The stability that homeownership provides, knowing your housing cost is fixed, having equity to borrow against in emergencies, passing something down to your children, all of that becomes inaccessible. Orlando's economy depends on tourism and service industries, yet the people who staff the theme parks, hotels, and restaurants are increasingly unable to afford living anywhere near where they work. Cape Coral-Fort Myers lands at number 9, and this one stings because it was supposed to be a success story. During the pandemic, this area became a boomtown. Remote workers flooded in, developers rushed to build, prices soared. Everyone thought it would last forever. It didn't. Now, the region grapples with overbuilt inventory and plunging demand. Too many houses were thrown up too fast, often in areas without the infrastructure or services to support them. Many buyers purchased sight unseen at peak prices, lured by the promise of Florida sunshine and low taxes. They paid top dollar for homes that are now worth significantly less. The financial pain is real and widespread. Homeowners who bought at the peak are underwater, stuck with mortgages higher than their home's current value. Selling means taking a loss. Staying means watching their investment crater. For many, this isn't just a bad investment. It's their life savings. The instability ripples outward. Local businesses struggle as consumers tighten their belts. Construction slows. The boomtown energy evaporates, replaced by uncertainty and regret. What makes this particularly painful is the human element. These weren't just speculators flipping houses. Many were families making what they thought was a sound decision, relocating for better weather, lower taxes, a fresh start. They trusted the market. They believed the hype. Now they're trapped in homes they overpaid for, in communities that haven't developed the amenities promised, facing financial stress they never anticipated. Some developments sit partially finished, with empty lots and unbuilt infrastructure serving as monuments to failed speculation. At number 8, we have Daytona Beach, Ormond Beach, where the gap between income and housing costs is among the worst in the state. Incomes here are well below Florida's average, yet house prices soared along with the rest of the market. The income-to-home price ratio tells a harsh story. Typical wages can't justify typical home prices. Not even close. Families earning $40,000 or $50,000 a year are looking at homes priced at $400,000 or more. The math doesn't work. That gap leaves entire communities priced out. People who grew up here, who work here, who want to stay. They can't afford to. They're either stuck renting in substandard conditions or forced to move far from job hubs, adding long commutes and transportation costs to their already strained budgets. The social fabric frays when working people can't afford to live near where they work. Schools lose teachers, hospitals lose nurses, restaurants lose staff, communities lose cohesion. The Daytona Beach area has historically been a working-class region with modest incomes. Tourism drives much of the economy, but those jobs don't pay enough to afford the inflated housing market. The disconnect is striking. The people who service the tourism industry, who make the beaches and attractions run, are being systematically priced out of living anywhere near those jobs. Commutes get longer, quality of life deteriorates. The community becomes stratified between those who can afford to stay and those forced to leave. Port St. Lucie takes number 7, and the transformation here has been staggering. Since 2020, house prices jumped roughly 55%. This was a place where affordable Florida living was still possible. Not anymore. What used to be within reach for typical buyers is now a stretch, if it's attainable at all. The rapid price surge wasn't driven by improving wages or economic growth in the region. It was driven by external demand. Investors, remote workers, retirees cashing out from expensive markets up north. Now, as demand softens and the market cools, homeowners face a new risk: being stuck with overvalued properties as prices plateau or decline. If you bought near the peak, you're vulnerable. If you need to sell for a job change or family emergency, you might not be able to without losing money. The promise of homeownership as a path to financial security starts to look more like a trap. Port St. Lucie was built as an affordable alternative to the pricier coastal markets. For decades, it served that purpose well. Families could buy modest homes, build equity, and enjoy a decent quality of life without breaking the bank. That formula has collapsed. The 55% price increase in just 4 years represents a fundamental shift. Wages didn't increase 55%. Productivity didn't increase 55%. Only prices did. That gap represents pure speculation, pure external demand, overwhelming local affordability. Sebastian Vero Beach comes in at number 6 with a similar story. House prices climbed sharply while wages stayed flat, pushing local housing costs out of reach for many residents. But there's an added layer of pain here: rising insurance costs and limited rental supply. Florida's insurance market has been in chaos, with premiums spiking and some insurers pulling out of the state entirely. For homeowners, that means higher costs just to protect their investment. For renters, it means landlords passing those costs along, driving rents even higher. Limited rental supply makes it worse. When there aren't enough rental units to meet demand, prices rise. Competition gets fierce. Cost-burdened renters, those spending more than 30% of their income on housing, become the norm, not the exception. Many here are spending 40, 50, even 60% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. That doesn't leave much for anything else. The insurance crisis adds a dimension of instability that many other markets don't face as acutely. Hurricane risk is real in Florida, and insurers have responded by either dramatically raising rates or exiting the market. Some homeowners find themselves unable to get coverage at any price, forced into state-run plans of last resort that cost even more. This creates a cascading effect. Higher insurance means higher monthly costs for homeowners, which gets passed to renters, which makes housing even less affordable across the board. Number 5 is Northport Sarasota Bradenton, where median home listings topped nearly $500,000. That's a heavy load for working-class households. Even with 2 incomes, even with savings, even with everything going right, it's a stretch. And that's just the list price. Add in closing costs, insurance, taxes, maintenance, and the real cost of homeownership climbs even higher. For many families, it's simply out of reach. Even as some price corrections start kicking in, rent and living costs remain stubbornly high. Renters and owners alike are struggling. Homeowners are house poor, pouring so much of their income into housing that they have little left for anything else. Renters are one emergency away from financial disaster. The middle ground, the space where housing is affordable and life is manageable, has all but disappeared. Sarasota has long been known as a desirable retirement destination, and that reputation has driven prices for decades. But the recent surge has pushed things beyond historical norms. $500,000 for a median home means that only higher earners can comfortably afford homeownership. Teachers, police officers, healthcare workers, retail employees, the backbone of any functioning community, find themselves locked out. What happens to a community when the people who make it run can't afford to live there? That's the question Sarasota is being forced to answer. Panama City takes number 4, and the pattern is familiar by now. Rapid price gains during the housing boom made homeownership out of reach for many locals. But the problem doesn't stop there. Stagnant incomes mean earning power hasn't kept up. High insurance premiums, driven by hurricane risk and a volatile market, add another layer of cost. Property taxes keep climbing. The squeeze is relentless. Many residents are stuck renting or overpaying with no clear path forward. The stability that homeownership is supposed to provide, it's not there. Instead, there's stress, uncertainty, and a growing sense that the system isn't built for people like them. Panama City also faces unique challenges from its history of hurricane damage. Hurricane Michael in 2018 devastated the area, and the rebuild process drove prices up as supply tightened. Insurance became more expensive and harder to obtain. The combination of natural disaster recovery and housing speculation created a brutal market for locals trying to stay in their community. Many longtime residents who lost homes in the hurricane found they couldn't afford to rebuild or buy back in at the new inflated prices. Now we're into the top 3, where the crisis reaches its peak intensity. At number 3 is Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, and this is where things get truly brutal. This metro area is home to some of the worst housing cost burdens in the entire country. In parts of the region like Hialeah, homeowners spend roughly 37% of their income on housing. That's well above the threshold for being cost burdened. And renters? They have it even worse. Median rents here are among the highest nationwide, often consuming 38% or more of monthly income. For lower income renters, it can be 50, 60, even 70%. Soaring property taxes and insurance costs compound the problem. As property values rise, so do taxes. As hurricane risk increases and insurers flee, premiums spike. Wage growth? It's slow. It's not keeping up. Not even close. The result is a housing market where both owning and renting feel almost unaffordable. People are working full-time, sometimes multiple jobs, and still struggling to make rent. Families are forced to double up, cramming multiple generations or multiple families into single units. The housing crisis here isn't abstract. It's lived every single day. Miami has become a global city, attracting international investment and wealthy transplants. That global appeal drives prices, but local wages reflect a regional economy, not a global one. The disconnect creates impossible conditions for working-class residents. Miami's service economy depends on people who can't afford to live in Miami. They commute from cheaper areas, sometimes 2 hours each way, burning time and money just to get to jobs that don't pay enough to afford housing any closer. The cultural impact is profound. Miami has always been a diverse, dynamic city with distinct neighborhoods and strong community ties. As housing costs soar, those communities fracture. Longtime residents are displaced. Cultural institutions close. The character of neighborhoods shifts as wealthier newcomers replace locals who can no longer afford to stay. Miami risks losing the very diversity and vibrancy that made it attractive in the first place. At number 2, we have Crestview Fort Walton Beach Destin, an emerging flashpoint that many people don't talk about, but should. The income to home price ratio here is one of the worst in Florida, nearly 14.8 to 1. Let that sink in. The typical home costs almost 15 times what the average household earns in a year. That's not a housing market. That's a barrier. A wall. Typical wages nowhere near justify buying. Not for teachers, not for service workers, not for most of the people who actually live and work in the area. This metro is heading toward deeper affordability trouble. The gap is widening, not closing. Without intervention, policy changes, new construction focused on workforce housing, something to correct the imbalance. This area risks becoming functionally unlivable for anyone who isn't wealthy or willing to take on crushing debt. The community fabric is at stake. When working people can't afford to live where they work, everyone suffers. The Destin area, in particular, has become a premier vacation destination with high-end resorts and tourism infrastructure. That tourism success has driven property values through the roof, but the jobs created by tourism don't pay enough to afford local housing. Workers in restaurants, hotels, retail, and service industries find themselves priced out entirely. Some live in overcrowded conditions, multiple workers sharing small apartments to split rent. Others commute from far outside the area, sacrificing hours of their day and significant portions of their paycheck to transportation costs. Number 1. Naples Immokalee, Marco Island. The median listing price here in 2024 hit around $770,000. That's roughly 70% higher than Florida's overall median. For most working people, homeownership here is simply impossible. Not difficult. Not a stretch. Impossible. This creates exclusionary housing conditions where entire classes of people, those who clean the hotels, staff the restaurants, teach in the schools, provide healthcare, are priced out entirely. The inequality is stark and visible. Wealth concentrates in gated communities and luxury developments, while service workers commute from far away, sometimes an hour or more, adding transportation costs and time to their already difficult lives. The area becomes less diverse, less dynamic, less resilient. It becomes a playground for the wealthy, maintained by a workforce that can't afford to live there. That's not sustainable. It's not just. And it's the logical endpoint of a housing market that prioritizes investment returns over human needs. Naples represents the extreme end of Florida's affordability crisis, but it's not an anomaly. It's where the current trajectory leads. When housing becomes primarily an investment vehicle rather than a basic need, this is the result. Entire regions become economically segregated, accessible only to the wealthy, while the working people who make those places function are pushed further and further away. The irony is brutal. Naples markets itself as a paradise, a high quality of life destination. But that quality of life depends entirely on workers who can't afford to access it themselves. The restaurants, the golf courses, the pristine beaches, the medical facilities, none of it functions without workers. Yet those workers are treated as disposable, expected to commute from affordable areas while accepting wages that guarantee they'll never be able to live in the community they serve. So, what's actually driving this crisis? It's not one thing. It's a convergence of forces that collided to create a perfect storm. Start with pandemic-fueled migration. When remote work became widespread, people fled expensive cities and moved to Florida. They brought their big city budgets with them, driving up prices in areas that weren't prepared for that kind of demand. Someone selling a home in San Francisco or New York could afford to pay cash, over asking price, for properties in Florida, pricing out locals who needed mortgages and had to compete within their regional income constraints. Investor buying accelerated the problem. Hedge funds, private equity firms, individual investors, they bought up properties en masse, often sight unseen, treating housing as a financial asset rather than a human necessity. When investors compete with families, families lose. It's that simple. Investors can pay cash, close quickly, and outbid anyone who needs financing. In some Florida markets, investor purchases accounted for more than 30% of all sales during the pandemic boom. That's not a free market serving human needs. That's a rigged game. Lax zoning rules made it worse. Many Florida cities didn't have strong regulations to ensure balanced growth, to protect affordable housing stock, or to prevent speculative bubbles. Developers built what was profitable, not what was needed. Luxury condos and single-family homes dominated, while workforce housing lagged far behind. The result is a mismatch. Plenty of expensive units, not enough affordable ones. New construction hasn't kept up with low-income and workforce housing needs. Builders focus on higher-margin projects. Affordable housing doesn't pencil out the same way, especially when land costs and construction costs keep rising. So low-wage earners get squeezed into overpriced rentals or pushed to distant suburbs, increasing their cost of living overall. Longer commutes mean more gas, more car maintenance, more time away from family. The hidden costs add up. And then there are the structural issues: insurance premiums, property taxes, hurricane risk, zoning rules. Combined, they create a system that's fragile and unsustainable. Many homes are priced beyond what locals can manage long term. The idea that rising prices reflect improving living standards falls apart when you look at who's actually able to afford housing. It's not the people who live and work in these communities. It's outsiders with capital, investors looking for returns, retirees cashing out from expensive markets elsewhere. So what happens next? Expect more price corrections in the hardest hit metros, especially where demand is slowing, but supply was inflated. Foreclosures will rise. Abandoned developments will sit empty. The speculative frenzy that drove prices up will reverse, and the people who bought at the peak will pay the price. Some will walk away, letting the bank take the property. Others will struggle for years, trying to dig out from under a bad decision they made in good faith. Rental markets will get tighter and more unstable. As ownership becomes harder, more people will rent. But rental supply isn't growing fast enough to meet that demand. Rents will stay high, possibly climb higher. More working-class renters will face displacement, forced further out from job centers and community networks. The social strain will increase. Families will be separated. Communities will fragment. Unless policy changes, the housing gap will deepen. Zoning reform is essential. Cities need to allow denser development, mixed-use neighborhoods, and more diverse housing types. Incentives for affordable housing can help, but they need to be meaningful, not token gestures that developers can ignore. Stricter regulation on speculative buying, on investor purchases, on short-term rentals that remove units from the long-term market, all of these can make a difference. But they require political will. They require communities to prioritize people over profit. Without change, Florida risks becoming increasingly unlivable for regular residents. The service economy depends on workers who can't afford to live near their jobs. The social fabric depends on diverse, stable communities. The future depends on housing being accessible, not just for the wealthy, but for everyone. When teachers can't afford to live in the districts where they teach, when nurses can't afford to live near the hospitals where they work, when the people who make communities function are forced out, everyone loses. If you live in Florida, or plan to, this isn't just numbers on a screen. This is about real families making impossible choices. It's about shrinking opportunity and a housing system increasingly designed for investors, not people. It's about young adults giving up on the idea of ever owning a home. It's about seniors on fixed incomes being priced out of communities they've lived in for decades. It's about teachers, nurses, firefighters, and service workers being told they don't belong in the places they serve. But it's not hopeless. Recognizing the problem is the first step. Understanding the forces at work, the policy failures, the structural issues. That's how change begins. Demand for fair housing, for access for workers and renters and locals, can still shift the narrative. Pressure on local governments to reform zoning, to incentivize affordable housing, to regulate speculation. It works when communities organize and push back. Because at its core, shelter is a right, not an investment. Housing should serve people, not portfolios. The market alone won't fix this. It created this. What's needed is intentional, sustained action to rebalance the system, to ensure that the people who make Florida run can actually afford to live there. This crisis didn't happen overnight, and it won't be solved overnight. But every movement starts with awareness. Every change starts with people deciding they've had enough. Florida's housing crisis is severe, but it's not inevitable. With the right policies, the right priorities, and the right pressure, a different future is possible. One where housing is stable, accessible, and serves the needs of communities, not just capital. If you found this useful, if you want more deep dives like this, clear, data-driven, no fluff, there's plenty more where this came from. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for the change that's needed.